Tonight, we travel back nearly 700 years to a small farming village nestled between rolling hills and a winding river. The village had no official name on any map, for maps were rare and expensive things. To travelers passing through, it was simply known as the village by the old oak tree. As the first light of dawn slowly crept across the horizon, a thin blanket of mist covered the fields. The air was cool and damp. Dew clung to every blade of grass, sparkling like tiny jewels whenever a ray of sunlight managed to break through the fog. In a small wooden cottage at the edge of the village lived a farmer named Thomas. Thomas was not a knight, nor a king, nor a wealthy merchant. He owned no castle and commanded no army. Yet, like millions of ordinary people throughout medieval Europe, his daily work helped feed an entire kingdom. The rooster crowed long before sunrise. Thomas opened his eyes. Thomas opened his eyes. His bed was nothing more than a straw mattress covered with a rough wool blanket. It was not particularly comfortable, but compared to many villagers, he considered himself fortunate. The cottage was dark except for the faint glow of dying embers in the hearth. Beside him, his wife Margaret still slept quietly. The house was small. One room served as kitchen, dining room, and bedroom all at once. Their two children slept on simple straw pallets near the fireplace. For a moment, Thomas listened. He heard only the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant sound of sheep bleating somewhere beyond the village. Another day had begun. Slowly he rose from bed and pulled on a wool tunic. The fabric felt coarse against his skin. Most medieval villagers owned very few clothes. A good wool garment might last for many years. Nothing was wasted. Every object had value. Outside, the village was beginning to wake. Thin streams of smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Dogs barked. A cartwheel creaked somewhere in the distance. The smell of damp earth mixed with wood smoke drifted through the morning air. Thomas stepped outside. The old oak tree stood proudly in the center of the village. According to local stories, it had already been ancient when Thomas's grandfather was born. No one knew exactly how old it was. The villagers often gathered beneath its branches to exchange news, settle disputes, and celebrate festivals. Today, however, there was little time for gathering. Spring planting season had arrived. Fields needed attention. Seeds needed sowing. Animals needed feeding. The survival of the village depended upon the work completed during these precious weeks. Thomas walked toward his small plot of land. The earth looked dark and rich after recent rains. He knelt and scooped a handful of soil into his palm. It crumbled perfectly between his fingers. A good sign. If weather remained favorable, harvest might be plentiful this year. For medieval farmers, weather meant everything. Too much rain could destroy crops. Too little rain could bring famine. A single storm at the wrong time could ruin months of labor. There were no weather forecasts, no scientific predictions, only experience, observation, and hope. As the sun slowly rose higher, golden light spilled across the valley. Birds began singing from nearby hedges. The village looked peaceful. Yet beneath this peaceful appearance lay a life filled with hard work. Thomas's day had barely begun. Before noon, he would plow fields, repair a fence, feed livestock, and help a neighbor whose ox had fallen ill. Such responsibilities were normal. In medieval villages, survival depended on cooperation. People helped one another because one day they might need help themselves. The rhythm of village life had changed very little for generations. Children grew up watching their parents work the same fields. They learned the same skills, followed the same traditions, and lived according to the same cycle of seasons. Spring brought planting. Summer brought growth. Autumn brought harvest. Winter brought endurance. Year after year, generation after generation, as Thomas stood in the field watching the morning sun dissolve the last traces of mist, he could not know that historians, centuries later, would study lives like his to better understand the medieval world. To kings and nobles, Thomas was almost invisible, but to history, he represented the everyday reality of an entire age. And so, beneath the warming sky, surrounded by birdsong and fertile earth, the medieval farmer picked up his wooden plow and began another ordinary day, a day remarkably similar to thousands that came before it. The morning sun had now climbed above the distant hills, bathing the valley in a soft, golden light. Thomas adjusted his wool cap and looked across the open field stretching beyond the village. From a distance, the farmland appeared peaceful and endless, divided into long, narrow strips that belonged to different families. But every farmer knew how much labor those fields demanded. The soil did not plow itself. Seeds did not plant themselves, and crops certainly did not harvest themselves. For Thomas and his neighbors, nearly every waking hour revolved around the land. The field before him had been worked by his father, before that, his grandfather, and before him, generations whose names had long been forgotten. Each year, they followed the same ancient routine. Nature dictated the schedule, the seasons gave the orders, and the villagers obeyed. Thomas reached his small wooden plow. The tool was simple. Its wooden frame showed signs of years of use. Several repairs could be seen where pieces had cracked and been carefully mended. Iron was expensive. Wood was plentiful. A farmer learned quickly how to repair his own tools. Nearby stood his ox, a large and patient animal named Brutus. The ox was perhaps the most valuable possession Thomas owned. Without it, plowing the fields would take far longer and require exhausting physical labor. Thomas gently patted the animal's neck. The ox snorted softly. A cloud of warm breath drifted into the cool morning air. Together, they began their work. The wooden plow cut into the damp soil. Slowly, steadily, row after row. The work required patience. The ox pulled, Thomas guided, and the earth opened beneath the blade. As he worked, birds followed closely behind. They searched the freshly turned soil for worms and insects exposed by the plow. The birds seemed to know exactly when the farmers would begin their day. By mid-morning, the field was alive with activity. Across neighboring plots, other villagers worked alongside their families. Some planted barley, others prepared land for wheat. Children carried baskets of seed. Women gathered stones from the fields. Men repaired fences damaged during winter storms. Everyone had a role. Even the youngest children contributed. A medieval village could not afford idleness. Every pair of hands mattered. Thomas paused briefly to drink water from a small leather flask. The cool water tasted refreshing after hours of work. Looking toward the village, he could see smoke rising from dozens of cottages. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. The sound drifted gently across the countryside. The bells marked the passage of time. Most villagers owned no clocks. The church bell served as their clock. Its familiar sound guided daily life. The ringing reminded Thomas that the morning was already half gone. There was still much to do. He resumed plowing. The sun grew warmer. Sweat formed beneath his tunic. His hands felt rough against the wooden handles, yet he barely noticed. Hard labor had been part of his life since childhood. He could scarcely imagine another way of living. By noon, the village field shimmered beneath bright sunlight. The air smelled of fresh earth and growing grass. A gentle breeze moved across the valley. For a moment, everything seemed calm, peaceful, almost timeless. Yet medieval farmers lived with constant uncertainty. A single failed harvest could bring hunger. Several failed harvests could bring disaster. Stories of famine were passed from one generation to the next. The elderly still remembered years when crops had failed, years when bread became scarce, years when families survived on whatever food they could find. Such memories encouraged caution. Nothing was wasted. Every seed mattered. Every harvest mattered. Every loaf of bread mattered. As Thomas continued working, another farmer approached from a neighboring field. It was William, an old friend. William carried a wooden hoe over his shoulder. "Good soil today," he remarked. Thomas nodded. The rain came at the right time. The two men exchanged only a few words before returning to work. Conversation was brief during planting season. There simply wasn't enough time. Still, the presence of neighbors provided comfort. Farming could be difficult, but no one faced those challenges entirely alone. Throughout the afternoon, the fields remained busy. Oxen moved slowly through the soil. Tools scraped against the earth. Birds sang from nearby trees. The sounds blended together into a rhythm that had existed for centuries, a rhythm older than the village itself, older than the kingdom, perhaps older than memory. As shadows slowly lengthened, Thomas finally finished plowing the last section of his field. He stopped and surveyed his work. Straight furrows stretched neatly across the land. Tomorrow, he would begin planting. For now, the hardest task of the day was complete. The sun had started its slow journey toward the western horizon. Golden light illuminated the fields. The village appeared almost magical beneath the evening glow. Thomas smiled quietly. There was satisfaction in honest work. The field was ready. The seeds were prepared. And another important step toward the harvest had been completed. Yet tomorrow would bring new challenges. Because in medieval life, the work of the fields never truly ended. It simply changed with each passing day. And as the evening breeze whispered across the freshly turned earth, Thomas gathered his tools and began the walk back toward the village, where supper, family, and a brief moment of rest awaited him before another dawn arrived. The sun had disappeared beyond the western hills, and darkness slowly settled over the village. One by one, candles and oil lamps flickered to life inside the cottages. The day's work in the fields was finished, but not everyone in the village rested when the farmers returned home. Near the center of the village stood a small stone building with a chimney that constantly released smoke into the sky. This was the blacksmith's workshop. Even from a distance, villagers could hear the familiar sound, clang, clang, clang. The ringing of hammer against iron echoed through the evening air. Inside worked a man named Robert, the village blacksmith. If Thomas the farmer helped feed the village, Robert helped keep it functioning. Without the blacksmith, plows could not be repaired. Horses could not be properly shod. Broken tools would remain broken, and farming itself would become far more difficult. The workshop was warm even during winter. A large forge glowed brightly near the center of the room. Orange flames danced among glowing coals. The heat filled every corner of the building. Robert wiped sweat from his forehead as he worked. His arms were strong from years of lifting hammers and shaping metal. Every day he transformed rough pieces of iron into useful tools. It was demanding work, but it was respected work. Many villagers considered the blacksmith one of the most important people in the community. Tonight, Robert was repairing a plow blade damaged during spring planting. The iron had cracked after striking a large buried stone. Such accidents were common. The countryside was filled with hidden rocks waiting beneath the soil. Carefully, Robert placed the damaged metal into the forge. The coals glowed brighter as he worked the bellows. The bellows were made from leather and wood. Each push forced air into the fire. The flames grew hotter. The iron slowly changed color. Dark gray became red. Red became bright orange. Soon it glowed like a piece of the sun itself. When the metal was ready, Robert lifted it with long iron tongs. The heat shimmered in the air around it. He carried it to the anvil. The anvil was one of his most valuable possessions. Its surface was scarred from countless years of use. Generations of blacksmiths had worked on similar anvils. Robert raised his hammer, then brought it down. Clang, sparks flew again. Clang, tiny stars of orange light scattered across the workshop floor. The rhythm continued, steady, patient, precise. With each strike, the metal slowly took shape. Outside, several children paused to watch through the open doorway. They always enjoyed seeing the sparks. To them it seemed almost magical. Many villagers viewed blacksmiths with a mixture of admiration and mystery. After all, they transformed cold, hard iron into useful objects through fire alone. In a world where few people understood science, such skills could appear extraordinary. As Robert worked, an elderly farmer entered the workshop. His name was John. In his hands he carried a broken hoe. The wooden handle remained intact, but the iron blade had snapped in two. "Can you repair this?" he asked. Robert examined the tool carefully, then nodded. "It will take a few days." The farmer smiled. That was good news. Replacing a tool entirely would cost far more than repairing it. Most villagers owned only a handful of tools. They cared for them carefully. A broken tool was never simply thrown away. Everything had value. Everything could be repaired. The blacksmith's workshop often became a gathering place. While waiting for repairs, villagers exchanged stories. News traveled slowly during the medieval period. There were no newspapers, no radios, no telephones. Information spread from person to person. A traveler passing through might bring news from distant towns. A merchant might share stories from a nearby city. Such tales fascinated the villagers. Most would never travel far from their homes. The world beyond the surrounding hills felt vast and mysterious. Tonight, a traveling merchant had recently arrived. He spoke of a large market several days away. He described crowded streets filled with traders, spices from distant lands, fine cloth, exotic goods. The villagers listened with great interest. To them, these stories sounded almost unbelievable. Thomas himself occasionally visited the blacksmith after supper, not always because he needed repairs, sometimes simply to hear the latest news. This evening, he arrived carrying a small lantern. The warm light illuminated the dusty road before him. As he approached, he could already hear the hammer ringing inside. The familiar sound brought comfort. It was one of the many rhythms of village life. Just as farmers worked the fields, just as shepherds cared for flocks, just as bakers prepared bread. the blacksmith shaped iron. Each person contributed something important. Together, they formed the foundation of the village. Inside the workshop, Thomas greeted Robert. The two men spoke briefly about planting season, the weather, and hopes for a successful harvest. Such conversations occurred almost every evening, simple conversations, yet meaningful ones, for village life depended upon cooperation and shared effort. Hours passed. The forge continued to glow, the hammer continued to ring. Outside stars appeared overhead. The village gradually grew quiet. Families gathered inside their cottages. Children drifted to sleep. Dogs settled beside doorways. The countryside became peaceful once more. At last, Robert finished his final task of the evening. The repaired plow blade rested upon the workbench, strong and ready for another season. Satisfied, he allowed the forge to cool. The bright flame slowly faded. Orange became red. Red became darkness. The workshop grew quieter. The day's labor was complete. Tomorrow, before sunrise, farmers would once again head to the fields. And sooner or later, someone would arrive carrying a broken tool, a damaged horseshoe, or a worn plow blade. And once again, the blacksmith's hammer would echo through the village. Clang, 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 a sound as familiar as birdsong, a sound that had accompanied village life for generations, and one that would continue long after this peaceful evening came to an end. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when the village began to stir. Today was market day. For most of the week, life in the village followed a familiar rhythm. Farmers worked their fields. Shepherds tended their flocks. Craftsmen labored in their workshops. But market day was different. It was a day of activity, a day of opportunity, a day when people from many villages gathered together. Even before sunrise, Thomas was awake. The air felt cool and fresh as he stepped outside his cottage. A thin mist rested over the fields. Nearby, his ox grazed quietly. Birds sang softly from the hedgerows. The village looked peaceful. Yet beneath the calm surface, preparations were already underway. Several farmers loaded carts with vegetables. Others carried baskets of eggs. Some brought cheese, honey, wool, or freshly baked bread. Every family hoped to sell something. Every family hoped to buy something. Thomas carefully loaded a sack of barley onto his small cart. The harvest from the previous season had been good. He hoped to exchange some of it for salt and a few household necessities. Salt was especially valuable. It helped preserve food and improve flavor. In a time before refrigeration, preserving food for winter was essential. Soon, the village road became busy. Men, women, and children traveled together toward the market town. The journey would take several hours. No one seemed to mind. Market day offered something rare, a break from routine. As the sun rose higher, golden light spread across the countryside. The travelers followed a dirt road winding through fields and forests. Along the way, they met people from neighboring villages. Some led donkeys carrying goods. Others pushed carts filled with produce. Many walked. Conversations filled the morning air. People exchanged greetings, shared news, discussed weather and harvests. For many villages, these journeys were important social occasions. Life could be isolated in small farming communities. Market day connected people to the wider world. After several hours, the market town finally appeared. Its church tower rose above the surrounding buildings. Stone houses lined the streets. The town seemed enormous, compared to the tiny village Thomas called home. As they approached, the sounds of the market became louder. Voices, laughter, animals, the creaking of cartwheels, the ringing of church bells. The entire town seemed alive. Entering the marketplace felt like stepping into another world. Rows of wooden stalls filled the square. Merchants displayed goods from near and far. Fresh vegetables, barrels of fish, baskets of fruit, woolen cloth, leather boots, iron tools, candles, pottery, spices. Some of these goods had traveled hundreds of miles before reaching the market. To village farmers, such products seemed exotic and fascinating. Thomas guided his cart toward an open space. Soon, he arranged his barley for sale. The morning passed quickly. Customers stopped to inspect the grain. Questions were asked. Prices were discussed. Trades were negotiated. Most transactions involved bargaining. Money existed, of course, but many people still exchanged goods directly. A sack of grain might be traded for tools. Cheese might be exchanged for cloth. Every agreement required discussion. Every deal required patience. Nearby, entertainers performed for crowds. A musician played a simple tune on a wooden flute. Children laughed as a juggler tossed colorful balls into the air. Storytellers gathered listeners beneath shaded trees. For many villagers, these performances were as valuable as the market itself. Entertainment was rare. A traveling performer might bring stories from distant kingdoms, tales of knights, castles, battles, and adventures. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered. People enjoyed listening. Around midday, the smell of food filled the square. Fresh bread baked in nearby ovens, roasted meat turned slowly over open fires, sweet pastries tempted hungry travelers. Thomas purchased a simple meal of bread and cheese. He sat beneath a tree and watched the busy scene around him. The marketplace represented something remarkable. People from many different backgrounds gathered together. Farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, weavers, trowelers, priests. Each had a different purpose, yet all shared the same space. The market served as the economic heart of the region. Without it, villages would struggle to obtain necessary goods. As the afternoon continued, Thomas finally completed several successful trades. His barley brought a fair price. He purchased salt, a new wooden bucket, and a small iron knife crafted by a skilled blacksmith. These items would serve his family well. Nearby, he noticed a merchant selling colorful cloth imported from distant lands. The bright colors seemed almost magical compared to the simple garments worn by most villagers. Although he could not afford such luxuries, he enjoyed admiring them. The world beyond the village suddenly felt larger, more connected, more mysterious. By late afternoon, shadows began to lengthen. The market slowly started to empty. Merchants packed their goods, farmers loaded carts, travelers prepared for the journey home. The lively sounds of the day gradually faded. Thomas secured his purchases and joined the stream of people leaving town. The road home felt quieter. Many travelers were tired after a long day. Some walked silently. Others discussed the events of the market. Children often fell asleep in carts before reaching home. The setting sun painted the countryside in shades of gold and orange. Fields glowed warmly beneath the evening sky. Birds settled into trees. The air cooled pleasantly. As the village finally came into view, Thomas felt a sense of satisfaction. Market day had been successful. The family now possessed supplies they needed. Tomorrow, life would return to normal. The fields would once again demand attention. The crops would continue growing. The endless cycle of village life would continue. Yet market day had provided something special. A brief glimpse of a larger world. A reminder that beyond the quiet fields and familiar cottages existed countless other villages, towns, and people living lives very much like their own. And as darkness settled gently over the countryside, Thomas returned home, grateful for the day's journey and ready for the peaceful evening ahead. The sun had long disappeared beyond the distant hills. A deep blue twilight settled over the countryside. The fields, so busy during the day, now rested beneath the growing darkness. A cool breeze drifted through the village streets. One by one, cottage windows glowed with candlelight. Families gathered around their hearths. Children prepared for bed. Animals settled quietly into barns and shelters. Yet one place in the village remained lively long after sunset. The tavern. Standing near the old oak tree at the center of the village, the tavern was one of the few buildings where villagers regularly gathered after their work was done. Its wooden sign creaked gently in the evening breeze. Warm, golden light spilled from its windows. Laughter drifted through the open doorway. For many villagers, the tavern was more than a place to eat and drink. It was the social heart of the community. Tonight, after a long day of work, Thomas decided to stop by before returning home. The planting season was progressing well. His field was nearly ready. A brief evening among friends sounded pleasant. As he approached the tavern, he could already hear voices inside. The familiar sounds felt welcoming. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. Immediately, warmth surrounded him. A large fireplace crackled along one wall. The scent of wood smoke mixed with the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat. Candles flickered from wooden tables. Their gentle light danced across the room. The tavern was simple. Rough wooden beams crossed the ceiling. Long benches lined the walls. The floor consisted of packed earth covered with straw. Yet to the villagers, it felt comfortable, familiar, safe. Several farmers sat near the fireplace discussing the weather. Others exchanged stories about recent work in the fields. Tonight, after a long day of work, Thomas decided to stop by before returning home. The planting season was progressing well. His field was nearly ready. A brief evening among friends sounded pleasant. As he approached the tavern, he could already hear voices inside. The familiar sounds felt welcoming. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. Immediately, warmth surrounded him. A large fireplace crackled along one wall. The scent of wood smoke mixed with the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat. Candles flickered from wooden tables. Their gentle light danced across the room. The tavern was simple. Rough wooden beams crossed the ceiling. Long benches lined the walls. The floor consisted of packed earth covered with straw. Yet to the villagers, it felt comfortable, familiar, safe. Several farmers sat near the fireplace discussing the weather. Others exchanged stories about recent work, and thus a shepherd described a wandering fox that had been troubling his flock. Nearby, the blacksmith Robert shared news about a traveling merchant he had met earlier that week. Such conversations formed the daily news network of the medieval world. There were no newspapers, no radios, no internet. Information traveled through conversation, and the tavern served as one of the most important places for sharing it. Thomas found a seat beside a few familiar faces. The tavern keeper soon brought a mug of ale. The drink was mild and commonly consumed throughout medieval Europe. Water could sometimes be unsafe. Ale was often considered a more reliable option. Thomas took a sip. The warmth of the room and the gentle murmur of conversation made the evening feel peaceful. For a while, everyone simply relaxed. The day's hard work seemed far away. Then the tavern door opened once again. A traveler entered. Immediately, several villagers glanced toward him. Travelers always attracted attention. Most villagers rarely ventured far from home. Anyone arriving from distant places brought valuable news and fascinating stories. The traveler removed his cloak and sat near the fireplace. After ordering food, he began speaking with the tavern keeper. Before long, curious villagers gathered nearby. The traveler had come from a large town several days away. He described crowded markets, fields, stone walls, busy streets filled with merchants and craftsmen. For the villagers, these descriptions seemed almost unbelievable. Their own village contained only a few dozen cottages. The idea of thousands of people living together felt extraordinary. As the evening continued, the traveler shared more stories. He spoke of castles perched atop rocky hills, of wealthy merchants trading goods from distant lands, of ships arriving from across the sea. Some listeners nodded thoughtfully. Others stared in amazement. The wider world felt enormous compared to their quiet valley. Yet, through stories like these, villagers gained small glimpses of places they would likely never visit. Later in the evening, an elderly man named Walter began telling one of his favorite local legends. The children who remained awake gathered close. Even many adults listened carefully. Walter claimed the story had been passed down for generations. According to the tale, a hidden treasure lay buried somewhere beneath the nearby forest. Long ago, a knight fleeing from battle supposedly concealed a chest of gold among the trees. No one had ever found it. Yet the legend survived. Each generation added new details, new mysteries, new possibilities. Whether true or not, the story entertained everyone. Medieval life contained few forms of organized entertainment. Stories filled that gap. Legends, folk tales, songs. These helped preserve history and strengthen community bonds. As the fire crackled softly, Walter's voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the tale. Outside, the night grew darker. Stars appeared overhead. The moon rose above the distant hills. Within the tavern, however, time seemed to slow. The warmth, the conversation, the flickering candlelight, everything created a comforting atmosphere. For a moment, worries about harvests, weather, and hard labor faded into the background. Eventually, one by one, villagers began heading home. The hour had grown late. Tomorrow would bring another demanding day. Fields still needed planting. Animals still required care. Life would continue as it always had. Thomas finished his drink and stood. He thanked the tavern keeper and stepped outside. The cool night air greeted him immediately. Above, countless stars filled the sky. Without modern lights, the heavens appeared brilliant. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of silver. Thomas paused for a moment beneath the old oak tree. The village was quiet now. Only a few distant voices could still be heard. Most families had already fallen asleep. He began walking toward home. His boots crunched softly along the dirt path. The familiar cottages stood silent beneath the moonlight. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. An owl called from a nearby tree. Otherwise, the night remained peaceful. When Thomas reached his cottage, he found Margaret already asleep. The fire burned low within the hearth. The children rested quietly beneath their blankets. Carefully, he settled into bed. The straw mattress felt comfortable after the long day. His eyes grew heavy. Outside, the village slept beneath the stars. The fields rested. The animals rested. And finally, the farmer rested too. Tomorrow, the sun would rise once again over the medieval village, and another chapter of ordinary life would begin. And every Sunday morning, the bell tower stood beside the village church, rising above the surrounding cottages. Though modest by modern standards, the church was the largest building in the village. Its stone walls had stood for many decades. Some villagers believed parts of it had existed since their great-grandparents were children. No one knew exactly how old it was. The church felt timeless, a permanent part of the landscape. After washing and dressing in his best tunic, Thomas prepared to leave. His clothing looked little different from what he wore during the week, but it was cleaner and carefully maintained. Special garments were rare. Most villagers owned only a few sets of clothes. People simply took extra care on Sundays. Outside, families emerged from their cottages. Men, women, children, grandparents. Everyone made their way toward the church. The narrow dirt paths filled with quiet conversation. Neighbors greeted one another warmly. Children played as they walked. For many villagers, Sunday offered a rare opportunity to spend time together outside of work. As Thomas approached the church, he admired the old stone building. Morning sunlight illuminated its weathered walls. Small stained glass windows reflected colorful patches of light. The wooden doors stood open. Inside, candles flickered softly. The air smelled faintly of wax and old timber. The church interior was simple. Rows of wooden benches filled the room. Stone pillars supported the roof overhead. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns upon the floor. Villagers gradually took their seats. The church soon filled with quiet voices. Then slowly, silence settled over the congregation. The service began. The village priest stepped forward. His voice echoed gently through the stone building. For many medieval villagers, religion formed an important part of daily life. Faith provided comfort, guidance, and hope. Life could be uncertain. Harvests could fail. Illness could strike unexpectedly. Storms could destroy crops. The future often seemed unpredictable. Religious traditions helped people face those uncertainties. As the service continued, the congregation listened attentively. Some prayed quietly, others reflected upon the week behind them. Outside, the countryside remained calm. The fields rested beneath the sunshine. For once, no work demanded immediate attention. The village enjoyed a rare moment of peace. After the service ended, many villagers remained near the church grounds. Sunday was also a social occasion. People exchanged news, discussed family matters, shared stories. Children played games beneath the old oak tree. Friends gathered in small groups. Laughter filled the air. Thomas met several neighbors he had not spoken with during the busy planting season. Everyone seemed pleased to have a brief break from their usual responsibilities. Nearby, elderly villagers sat together on wooden benches. They shared memories of earlier years, stories of harsh winters, exceptional harvests, and memorable village festivals. Their tales connected the younger generation to the past. History lived through storytelling. Long before books became common, memory preserved much of what people knew. As midday approached, families returned home. Sunday meals were often slightly more special than those eaten during the week. Nothing extravagant. Perhaps an extra loaf of bread, a larger serving of cheese, maybe a small portion of meat, if available. Such meals became opportunities for families to gather together. Thomas and Margaret sat beside their children near the fireplace. The meal was simple, but satisfying. The cottage felt warm and comfortable. Outside, sunlight danced across the fields. The afternoon passed peacefully. Some villagers visited relatives, others rested. Children explored nearby meadows and streams. Many people simply enjoyed the rare chance to slow down. For hard-working farmers, rest itself was valuable. The body needed time to recover. The mind needed time to relax. As evening approached, the church bells rang once more. Their sound drifted gently across the valley. The familiar note seemed softer now, more reflective. The sun began its descent toward the horizon. Golden light bathed the village in warmth. Long shadows stretched across the fields. A few villagers walked quietly along country paths. Others sat outside their cottages enjoying the cool evening air. Thomas stood near his field and looked across the landscape. Tomorrow, work would begin again. The plows would return. The oxen would pull their loads. Seeds would continue to be planted. Life would resume its familiar rhythm. But today had been different. Today had offered a moment of calm, a pause in the endless cycle of labor. The church, the community, and the traditions of Sunday had reminded everyone that life contained more than work alone. As darkness slowly settled across the countryside, candles began appearing once again in cottage windows. Families prepared for sleep. The village grew quiet. Above, stars emerged one by one. The moon rose over the hills, and beneath that peaceful sky, the medieval village rested, gathering strength for another week ahead. The bells would ring again next Sunday. The traditions would continue, and generation after generation, the people of the village would find comfort in these familiar rhythms of faith, community, and rest. Summer was slowly coming to an end. The long, warm days that had filled the countryside with growth were beginning to shorten. Morning air carried a slight chill. The leaves on some trees had started to show hints of gold and amber. Across the valley, the fields looked different now. Where green shoots had once emerged from the soil, tall waves of grain now swayed gently in the breeze. The harvest season had arrived. For the villagers, no time of year was more important. Everything they had worked toward since spring depended on the weeks ahead. A successful harvest meant food for the coming winter. A poor harvest could bring hardship. Every family understood the importance of these days. Before dawn, Thomas awoke. The cottage was still dark. Outside, the stars remained visible overhead. Yet already he could hear movement elsewhere in the village. Doors opening, footsteps on dirt paths, voices speaking quietly. Today would be a long day. The entire village would work together. Thomas dressed quickly and stepped outside. The eastern horizon glowed faintly with the first signs of sunrise. A cool mist rested over the fields. The air smelled fresh and earthy. For a moment he stood silently and admired the landscape. The golden grain stretched across the valley like an endless sea. Months of effort had produced this sight. Months of planting, weeding, repairing fences, protecting crops from storms and animals. Now, the reward stood before them. Soon, villagers began gathering near the fields. Men carried sickles, women brought baskets. Children prepared to help collect and transport the harvested grain. Even elderly villagers contributed where they could. Harvest season required every available hand. The work began as the first rays of sunlight reached the valley. Thomas grasped his sickle and stepped into the field. Carefully, he cut the first bundle of wheat. The stalks fell neatly into his hands. Nearby, dozens of villagers worked in rows. The sound of harvesting filled the morning air, rustling grain, soft conversation, the steady rhythm of sickles moving through the crops. The work demanded patience and endurance. Hour after hour, the villagers moved slowly across the fields. Bundles of grain accumulated behind them. Children gathered the stalks into larger sheaves. Others loaded them onto carts. The harvest progressed steadily. As the sun climbed higher, the day grew warmer. Sweat formed on foreheads. Hands became sore. Backs ached from bending. Yet nobody complained. This was the most important work of the year. Every sheaf represented future bread, future meals, future survival. Around midday, the villagers paused briefly to eat. Families sat together beneath scattered trees. Simple meals were shared: bread, cheese, apples, water, and ale. The break provided welcome relief. Laughter occasionally drifted through the air. Despite the hard work, harvest season often brought a sense of optimism. The grain looked healthy. The weather had remained favorable. The village had reason to hope. After the meal, work resumed. The afternoon sun bathed the countryside in golden light. The fields shimmered beautifully. Birds circled overhead, searching for scattered seeds. A gentle breeze swept through the valley. The landscape seemed almost magical. As Thomas worked, he remembered stories his grandfather used to tell, stories of harvests long ago, years of abundance, years of scarcity, years when storms arrived at the worst possible moment. Such memories reminded him how fortunate they had been this season. The weather could never be controlled, only respected, only endured. By late afternoon, much of the field had been harvested. Large stacks of grain stood across the landscape. The sight filled the villagers with satisfaction, visible proof of months of labor. The harvest was not yet complete. Several more days of work remained, but significant progress had been made. As the sun approached the horizon, its light turned deep orange. Long shadows stretched across the countryside. The temperature cooled. Gradually, the villagers began putting away their tools. Another day of harvesting had ended. Exhausted but content, they gathered near the edge of the field. For a few moments, everyone simply admired the view. Golden stacks of grain, rolling hills beyond, a sky painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple. It was a beautiful evening, one that seemed to reward their efforts. Thomas loaded the final bundle onto a cart. His muscles ached. His hands felt rough. Yet he smiled. The harvest was progressing well. That knowledge brought comfort. As darkness approached, the villagers returned home. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Dogs greeted their owners. Children spoke excitedly about the day's work. The village felt alive. Inside his cottage, Thomas sat beside the fire with his family. The meal tasted especially satisfying after such a long day. Outside, stars gradually appeared overhead. The countryside grew quiet once again. Tomorrow, the work would continue. More grain would be cut. More carts would be filled. More sheaves would be gathered. The harvest season waited for no one. Yet tonight, beneath the peaceful autumn sky, the villagers could rest knowing that their hard work was paying off. And somewhere beyond the dark fields, the future winter months seemed just a little less frightening. For the barns would soon be full, the grain stores would soon be stocked, and the village would be ready for whatever the coming season might bring. At last, the harvest was complete. For days and weeks, the villagers had worked from sunrise to sunset, gathering wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables from the fields. Now the barns were full, the grain stores were secured, the carts stood empty. For the first time in many months, the village could breathe a sigh of relief. The hardest work of the year was over, and that could mean only one thing. The harvest festival was about to begin. The festival was one of the most anticipated events of the year. Children looked forward to it. Adults looked forward to it. Even the elderly, who had attended dozens of harvest festivals throughout their lives, eagerly awaited the celebration. For a brief moment, worries about weather, crops, and labor could be set aside. The village would gather together and celebrate. The morning of the festival arrived bright and clear. Sunlight streamed across the countryside. The autumn sky was a brilliant shade of blue. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly harvested grain. The village looked different today. Colorful ribbons decorated doorways. Garlands of dried flowers hung from fences. Tables had been arranged beneath the great oak tree at the center of the village. Everyone wanted the village to look its best. After all, this was not merely a celebration. It was a tradition passed down through generations. Thomas awoke later than usual. There was no need to rush into the fields. No urgent work demanded his attention. The crops were safely stored. For once, he could enjoy a slower morning. As he stepped outside, he immediately noticed the cheerful atmosphere. Children ran through the village carrying bundles of flowers. Neighbors greeted one another warmly. Laughter drifted through the crisp autumn air. The entire community seemed lighter, happier. The festival preparations continued throughout the morning. Women baked fresh bread. Large pots of stew simmered over open fires. Cheese, apples, nuts, and roasted vegetables were arranged upon long wooden tables. Families contributed whatever they could. The celebration belonged to everyone. By midday, villagers began gathering near the oak tree. The old tree stood proudly as it had for generations. Many people believed it had witnessed more harvest festivals than anyone alive could remember. Its massive branches stretched across the village square, providing shade and shelter. Beneath those branches, the feast began. Long tables quickly filled with food. The smell was wonderful. Fresh bread, roasted meats, warm vegetable stew, honey cakes, baked apples. For many villagers, this would be one of the finest meals of the year. Thomas sat beside Margaret and their children. Nearby, friends and neighbors enjoyed their own meals. Conversations filled the air. Stories were exchanged. Old memories resurfaced. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate the successful harvest. As the afternoon continued, musicians arrived. One carried a fiddle. Another brought a flute. A third carried a small drum. Soon, music echoed across the village. Simple melodies filled the air. The tunes were familiar. Many had been played at harvest festivals for generations. Children began dancing first. Their laughter spread quickly. Before long, adults joined them. The village square transformed into a place of music and movement. Even some of the elderly tapped their feet to the rhythm. The harvest festival was not merely about food, it was about community, about shared success. The villagers had worked together through spring, summer, and autumn. Now they celebrated together as well. As the day progressed, games and contests began. Young men tested their strength. Children raced through the village lanes. Storytellers gathered audiences beneath the oak tree. Old legends once again came to life. Tales of knights, dragons, lost treasures, ancient battles. Whether true or not hardly mattered. The stories entertained everyone. Thomas particularly enjoyed listening to an elderly storyteller named Walter. The old man seemed capable of speaking for hours. His voice rose and fell dramatically as listeners gathered around him. The children listened with wide eyes. The adults smiled knowingly. Most had heard the stories many times before, yet they never seemed to grow old. As evening approached, the festival reached its most beautiful moment. The setting sun painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson. The harvested fields glowed beneath the warm light. The village looked almost magical. Lanterns were lit around the square. Their soft glow illuminated smiling faces. The musicians continued playing. The atmosphere became calm and peaceful. Thomas sat quietly for a moment and looked around. He saw neighbors laughing together, children chasing one another, friends sharing stories, families enjoying the evening. It reminded him how much depended upon cooperation. No farmer succeeded entirely alone. No family survived entirely alone. The village functioned because people helped one another. The harvest festival celebrated that truth. Darkness gradually settled across the valley. Above, stars began appearing in the sky. The first cool winds of autumn drifted through the village. The music softened. The conversations became quieter. The festival slowly approached its end. One by one, families began returning home. Children, exhausted from excitement, struggled to keep their eyes open. Parents carried sleeping youngsters through the moonlit streets. The village gradually grew peaceful once again. Before leaving, Thomas stood beneath the ancient oak tree. The lanterns flickered gently among its branches. The night air felt cool and refreshing. For a few moments, he simply listened. The distant voices, the fading music, the rustle of leaves overhead, the sounds blended into a memory he would carry throughout the coming winter. Tomorrow, ordinary life would return. Animals would still need care. Repairs would still need attention. Preparations for winter would begin. But tonight was different. Tonight was a celebration of abundance, of gratitude, of community. And as Thomas finally walked home beneath the starlit sky, he felt content. The harvest was complete. The village was safe. The food stores were full, and for one peaceful evening, everyone had shared in the joy of a successful year. The stars shone brightly above the sleeping countryside, and the medieval village rested beneath their gentle light. The harvest festival had come and gone. The music had faded. The lanterns had been put away. The long tables beneath the oak tree had been cleared. Life in the village slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet something had changed. The air felt cooler. The mornings arrived with a thin layer of frost upon the grass. The sun climbed lower in the sky each day. Autumn was quietly giving way to winter. For medieval villagers, winter was not merely another season. It was a challenge, a test of preparation, a test of patience, and a test of survival. Thomas understood this well. Every farmer did. The success of the harvest meant little if the food could not last until spring. Now that the crops had been gathered, a new phase of work began, preparing for winter. One chilly morning, Thomas stepped outside before sunrise. The village was silent. A pale moon still hung above the western hills. His breath appeared as small clouds in the cold air. The warmth of summer already felt like a distant memory. Across the valley, the harvested fields lay empty. Only short stubble remained where golden grain had once waved in the breeze. The landscape seemed quieter now, calmer, as if nature itself were preparing for rest. Thomas carried a lantern toward the barn. Inside, stacks of wheat and barley filled the storage area. The sight brought reassurance. Months of labor were safely protected beneath the roof. Yet grain alone would not be enough. Many other preparations remained. Throughout the village, families worked diligently. Food preservation became one of the most important tasks. Fresh vegetables would not survive the coming months. Meat could spoil quickly. Every household needed methods to extend the life of their food. Some vegetables were stored in cool cellars, others were dried. Apples were carefully packed into baskets. Herbs were hung from wooden beams inside cottages. Strings of onions and garlic decorated kitchen walls. Nothing was wasted. Every item represented valuable nourishment for the months ahead. Margaret spent much of her time organizing supplies. She carefully inspected every basket and container. Mold could ruin precious food stores. Rodents could cause serious damage. Attention to detail mattered. A single mistake might be costly. Meanwhile, Thomas focused on another essential task: firewood. Winter nights would be long and cold. Without sufficient fuel, staying warm would become difficult. Each day, villagers traveled to nearby woodlands. Axes echoed through the forest. Trees that had already fallen were cut into manageable pieces. Branches were gathered, logs were stacked. Children often helped carry smaller bundles. By late autumn, large piles of firewood appeared beside nearly every cottage. The stacks represented security, warmth, comfort, survival. One afternoon, Thomas and several neighbors worked together in the forest. The trees displayed brilliant autumn colors: gold, red, orange. Leaves drifted gently to the ground with every passing breeze. The forest seemed peaceful, almost magical. As they worked, conversations flowed easily. The urgency of harvest season had passed. People now had more time to talk. Stories were shared. Plans for winter were discussed. Predictions about the weather filled the air. No one truly knew what the coming winter would bring. Some winters were mild, others were severe. The uncertainty remained constant. As the weeks passed, preparations continued. The village blacksmith remained busy repairing tools before the cold weather arrived. Fences needed strengthening. Barn roofs required inspection. Animal shelters had to be secured against wind and snow. Every family followed a long list of seasonal tasks. The village moved with quiet determination. One evening, as darkness settled early across the countryside, Thomas visited the barn once more. The livestock stood calmly inside. The animals would spend much more time sheltered during winter. Fresh straw covered the floor. Extra feed had been stored nearby. The animals represented valuable assets. Keeping them healthy was essential. Thomas gently patted his ox before returning to the cottage. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. The glow illuminated the wooden walls. Margaret sat spinning wool near the hearth. The children listened as their grandmother told stories from years long past. Stories of legendary winters. Stories of deep snowdrifts. Stories of travelers becoming lost in blizzards. Whether every detail was true hardly mattered. The stories entertained and educated. They reminded everyone why preparation mattered. Outside, the wind whispered through the village. The nights grew longer. The stars appeared earlier each evening. The countryside gradually transformed. Trees shed their final leaves. Fields turned brown and quiet. Birds became less common. Nature itself seemed to be settling into sleep. One morning, the villagers awoke to find frost covering the landscape. The fields sparkled beneath the rising sun. Every blade of grass glistened like crystal. Children marveled at the sight. Adults viewed it differently. The frost was a message. Winter was approaching. There was no more time to waste. Final preparations accelerated. Food stores were checked again. Firewood piles were expanded. Warm clothing was repaired. Every family worked carefully. Every family hoped their efforts would be enough. Then one evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the first snowflakes began to fall. Only a few at first, tiny white specks drifting through the air. The villagers watched from cottage windows. The snowfall remained light. Yet its meaning was unmistakable. Winter had arrived. Thomas stood outside for a moment, beneath the darkening sky. Snowflakes landed softly upon his coat. The village looked peaceful. The cottages glowed warmly from within. Smoke rose from chimneys. The world felt quiet, still, almost timeless. He knew difficult months lay ahead, but he also knew the village was prepared. The barns were full, the firewood was stacked, the food was stored, the animals were sheltered. The work of autumn had been successful. And now, beneath the gentle snowfall, the medieval village entered its long winter rest. The season of cold nights, warm fires, and ancient stories was about to begin. Winter settled over the village like a thick wool blanket. Day by day the snow deepened. The fields that had once been filled with golden grain now lay hidden beneath a smooth layer of white. The roads became quieter. The forests stood silent. Even the river moved more slowly, its edges covered with ice. For Thomas and the villagers, life changed dramatically during winter. The endless work of planting and harvesting was over. Nature itself seemed to pause. The countryside rested, and so, in many ways, did the people. One morning, Thomas awoke before sunrise. The cottage was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Outside, the wind whispered against the wooden walls. The sound was soft but constant. For a few moments, he remained beneath his blanket listening. Winter mornings encouraged patience. There was little reason to rush. The fields could wait. The snow would not melt any time soon. Eventually, he rose and added fresh logs to the fire. The flames slowly returned to life. Orange light filled the room. Warmth spread through the cottage. Margaret stirred from sleep. The children remained wrapped in blankets. The simple comfort of a warm fire became one of the greatest pleasures of winter. Outside, dawn arrived slowly. The sun appeared weak behind gray clouds. Its light reflected off the snow, making the entire valley glow softly. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air immediately touched his face. His breath formed small clouds before him. The village looked beautiful. Every rooftop wore a blanket of snow. Icicles hung from wooden eaves. The old oak tree stood silent and white. Even the familiar dirt roads had disappeared beneath the snowdrift. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The usual sounds of village life were absent. No plows, no harvesting, no market carts, only silence, and the occasional call of a distant crow. Winter required a different kind of work. Animals still needed feeding. Firewood still needed gathering. Tools still required maintenance. Yet compared to the busy seasons of spring and autumn, life moved more slowly. The villagers spent far more time indoors, and as a result, winter became the season of stories. That evening, after supper, Thomas sat beside the hearth with his family. The fire crackled gently. Shadows danced upon the walls. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Inside, the cottage felt warm and safe. His grandmother began telling one of her favorite stories. The children listened carefully. Though they had heard the tale many times before, they never seemed to tire of it. The story spoke of a traveler who became lost in a snowstorm many generations ago. According to legend, he discovered a hidden chapel deep within the forest. Inside, mysterious monks offered him shelter. By morning, however, both the chapel and the monks had vanished. No one knew whether the tale was true. Perhaps it had changed over time. Perhaps it had never happened at all. Yet that hardly mattered. The story provided comfort during the long winter night. Throughout the village, similar scenes unfolded. Families gathered around fires. Stories passed from one generation to the next. Ancient legends survived because people continued telling them. Winter preserved history, not through books, but through memory. As the weeks passed, snowstorms occasionally swept across the countryside. The wind howled around cottages. Snow piled against doors. Travel became difficult, sometimes impossible. During such storms, villagers remained indoors. The world beyond their windows seemed distant and unreachable, yet inside, life continued. Women spun wool into yarn. Men repaired tools. Children played simple games. Candles flickered softly. The fire remained the center of daily life. One particularly cold evening, Thomas visited the tavern. The journey was short but challenging. Snow covered the path. The air stung his face. Yet when he opened the tavern door, warmth greeted him instantly. The room was crowded. Many villagers had gathered there to escape the cold. The fireplace burned brightly. Mugs of warm ale rested upon tables. Conversations filled the room. Winter often strengthened the sense of community. People spent more time together, more time talking, more time sharing stories. The outside world felt harsh and unforgiving. The village itself felt like a refuge. That night, a traveling storyteller happened to be staying at the tavern. Such visitors were rare during winter. The roads were dangerous. Most travelers preferred not to journey through snow and ice. The storyteller quickly became the center of attention. Villagers gathered around him eagerly. His stories spoke of distant kingdoms, towering castles, great battles, and adventures beyond imagination. For a few hours, listeners forgot the cold weather outside. Their minds traveled far beyond the snowy valley. The power of storytelling transformed the ordinary evening into something memorable. Later, as Thomas walked home beneath the stars, the snow reflected moonlight brilliantly. The landscape seemed almost magical. The entire world shimmered with silver light. No sound disturbed the night. only the crunch of snow beneath his boots. When he reached his cottage, the family had already gone to bed. The fire burned low. The room felt peaceful. He carefully added one final log to the hearth, then settled beneath his blanket. Outside, snow continued falling gently. The village slept beneath its white covering. The barns, the fields, the roads, everything rested. Winter would continue for many weeks, perhaps many months. Yet the villagers remained patient. They understood the rhythm of the seasons. Spring would eventually return. The snow would melt. The fields would awaken. The cycle would begin again. For now, however, there was only the quiet beauty of winter, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of family, and the endless procession of stories that carried the village through the longest nights of the year. As Thomas closed his eyes, the wind whispered softly beyond the walls. The fire crackled gently, and the medieval village drifted peacefully into another winter night. The winter seemed endless. Week after week, snow covered the fields. The trees stood bare against the gray sky. The river moved slowly beneath patches of ice. And yet, despite the cold, life continued. The villagers carried on with their daily routines. They cared for their animals, maintained their homes, shared stories by the fire, and waited patiently for the return of spring. Then one morning, exciting news spread through the village. A winter fair would soon be held in a nearby town. The announcement traveled quickly, from cottage to cottage, from neighbor to neighbor. People discussed it beside fires, in the tavern, at the church. The fair would provide something rare during the long winter months, a chance to gather, to trade, to celebrate, and perhaps most importantly, to see something new. Several days later, Thomas prepared for the journey. The weather had improved. Fresh snow still covered the countryside, but the roads remained passable. The sky was clear. The air felt cold and crisp. A perfect day for travel. Before sunrise, he joined a small group of villagers heading toward the town. Everyone wore heavy wool cloaks. Their boots crunched softly through the snow. The landscape around them seemed peaceful. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Frost sparkled on branches. The winter sun cast long shadows across the white fields. As they walked, conversations flowed easily. The fair gave people something to anticipate, something to discuss. Winter could sometimes feel repetitive. Events like this brought excitement to village life. After several hours, the town finally appeared on the horizon. Its stone walls stood against the snowy landscape. Colorful banners fluttered above the entrance gates. Even from a distance, the villagers could hear music. The fair had already begun. As Thomas entered the town square, he found himself surrounded by activity. Merchants filled the marketplace. Stalls lined the streets. Bright fabrics hung from wooden frames. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the cold air. Musicians played cheerful tunes. Children laughed as they ran through the crowd. The entire town seemed alive. Winter no longer felt cold or quiet. For one day, the season itself appeared transformed. Thomas wandered through the fair with curiosity. There was much to see. A blacksmith demonstrated his craft. A baker sold honey cakes. A merchant displayed exotic spices brought from distant lands. Each stall offered something fascinating, something unusual, something rarely seen in small farming villages. Yet among all the attractions, one particular figure attracted the greatest attention: a traveler. No one seemed to know exactly where he came from. He wore a long, dark cloak dusted with snow. His beard was streaked with gray. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder, and unlike most visitors, he carried no goods for sale. Instead, he carried stories. The traveler settled near a large fire in the center of the square. Before long, a crowd gathered around him. Thomas found a place among the listeners. The traveler's voice was calm and steady, perfect for storytelling. He began speaking of distant places, places far beyond anything most villagers had ever imagined. He described enormous cities where thousands of people crowded the streets. He spoke of castles with towers reaching toward the clouds. He told stories of vast forests stretching for days without end, of mountain peaks covered in snow year-round, of ships crossing endless seas. The listeners remained completely silent. Every word captured their attention. For many, these stories represented the closest they would ever come to seeing the wider world. The traveler continued. He spoke of marketplaces larger than entire villages, of libraries containing hundreds of books, of kings and queens, of merchants and sailors, of scholars studying the stars. The world seemed unimaginably large and wonderfully mysterious. As the afternoon passed, the crowd continued to grow. Even merchants paused their work to listen. The traveler never rushed. His words flowed slowly and comfortably, almost like a lullaby. Some listeners closed their eyes and imagined the places he described. Others stared into the fire, allowing the stories to carry them far beyond the snowy town square. Eventually, one child asked a question. "What is the most remarkable thing you've ever seen?" The traveler smiled. For a moment he remained silent. Then he pointed upward. "The night sky," he replied. The crowd looked surprised. Surely he had seen greater wonders, larger cities, more magnificent castles, more exotic lands. Yet he shook his head. "No matter where I travel," he said, "the stars remain the greatest mystery." The listeners nodded thoughtfully. Many had never considered such an answer. The traveler continued speaking. He described sleeping beneath open skies, watching constellations move across the heavens, listening to the wind in distant mountains, crossing forests illuminated only by moonlight. His stories were not merely adventures, they were reflections, quiet observations about the world and humanity's place within it. As evening approached, lanterns illuminated the fairgrounds. Their warm glow reflected against the snow. The marketplace looked magical, almost dreamlike. The traveler concluded his final story. The crowd applauded softly. People thanked him. Children smiled. Adults exchanged thoughtful glances. His tales had left an impression, not because they were grand, but because they reminded everyone how vast the world truly was. Later that evening, Thomas began the journey home. The stars shone brilliantly overhead. The snow sparkled beneath moonlight. The road felt peaceful. As he walked, he thought about the traveler's words, the castles, the cities, the distant lands, and especially the stars. Perhaps the traveler was right. Perhaps the greatest wonder had always been above them, visible every night, silent, ancient, endless. When Thomas finally reached the village, most windows were already dark. Families slept peacefully inside their cottages. The old oak tree stood quietly beneath the moon. The entire village seemed wrapped in silence. He stepped inside his home. The fire still glowed faintly. The room felt warm and welcoming. Before going to bed, he looked once more through the small window. The stars filled the sky, exactly as the traveler had described, beautiful, mysterious, and unchanged. Then, with thoughts of distant lands drifting through his mind, Thomas settled beneath his blanket. Outside, winter continued. Inside, the village slept. And somewhere beyond the snowy horizon, the mysterious traveler continued his endless journey through the medieval world. At last, the long winter began to loosen its grip on the valley. For months, snow had covered the fields. The trees had stood bare against gray skies. The river had moved slowly beneath sheets of ice. The world had seemed quiet, still, as though nature itself were sleeping. But now, small changes were beginning to appear. At first, they were easy to miss. A patch of dark earth showing through the snow, a drop of water falling from an icicle, a bird singing in the distance, tiny signs. Yet together they carried an important message. Spring was returning. One morning, Thomas awoke before sunrise. The cottage felt warmer than it had in weeks. The fire in the hearth had nearly gone out, but the air no longer carried the deep chill of midwinter. He pulled on his wool tunic and stepped outside. The village was quiet. A soft mist hung above the ground. The snow remained in many places, but it looked thinner now, smaller, weaker, as though winter were slowly retreating. Thomas walked toward the river. Along the way, he noticed water trickling through shallow ditches. The frozen earth was beginning to thaw. The river itself had changed. Large sections of ice had broken apart. The current flowed more freely. Sunlight reflected from the moving water. For the first time in months, the valley felt alive. He paused and listened. There it was, birdsong, a simple sound. Yet after the silence of winter, it felt extraordinary. A robin perched on a nearby branch. Its bright feathers stood out against the fading snow. Soon more birds would return, then flowers, then insects, and finally the endless green of spring. Back in the village, others had noticed the changes as well. People smiled more easily. Conversations carried a sense of optimism. Winter had tested everyone. Now the season of renewal was arriving. Children seemed especially excited. They splashed through muddy paths, searched for the first flowers, and spent more time outdoors. The village itself appeared to awaken alongside nature. During the following weeks, the transformation continued. Snow disappeared from the fields. The hills turned green once more. Tiny buds appeared on branches. Every day brought something new. A patch of wildflowers, a returning flock of birds, the scent of fresh grass. The valley gradually shed its winter appearance. One afternoon, Thomas walked to the edge of his field. Months earlier, the land had rested beneath deep snow. Now it lay exposed once again. Dark soil stretched before him, rich, fertile, ready. The sight filled him with determination. A new farming season was beginning. Soon the plows would return. Seeds would once again be planted. The cycle that had guided generations would continue. Nearby, other farmers inspected their own fields. They discussed weather patterns, soil conditions, plans for planting. The familiar rhythm of village life was returning. The blacksmith's workshop became busy once more. Tools damaged during winter needed repair. Plow blades required sharpening. Horseshoes needed replacement. The ringing of hammer against iron once again echoed through the village. Clang, clang, clang. The sound felt comforting, a sign that life was moving forward. The church bells also seemed brighter somehow. Their familiar notes drifted across a countryside awakening from its long sleep. Everywhere, signs of renewal appeared. The old oak tree at the center of the village began producing tiny green leaves. At first, only a few, then many more. Within weeks, its branches will once again provide shade beneath the summer sun. One evening, Thomas sat outside his cottage watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of gold and pink. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. The air felt soft and pleasant. Around him, the village hummed with life. Children laughed nearby. Birds called from the trees. A dog barked somewhere down the lane. Simple sounds. Yet after the quiet of winter, they felt almost magical. Margaret joined him. Together, they watched the fading sunlight. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need. The beauty of the evening said enough. Spring had returned. The difficult months were behind them. Ahead lay planting season, long days, hard work, and new opportunities. The future once again seemed full of possibility. As darkness gradually settled across the valley, stars appeared overhead, but they looked different now. The cold sharpness of winter nights had vanished. The sky felt gentler. The earth felt warmer. Everything seemed balanced, peaceful. Thomas reflected on the year that had passed, the planting, the harvest, the festival, the snow, the stories told beside the fire. Every season had brought its own challenges. Every season had brought its own rewards. Such was the rhythm of medieval life, a rhythm older than memory, a rhythm that connected people to the land, to one another, and to the passing years. Tomorrow, work would begin again. The fields awaited, the soil awaited, the future harvest awaited. But tonight was a moment of transition, a moment between winter and spring, between rest and labor, between endings and beginnings. The stars shone quietly above the village. The old oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, and beneath that peaceful sky, Thomas felt grateful. A new season had arrived. A new chapter had begun, and life, as always, continued. Spring had fully arrived. The fields were green once more. Birds filled the morning air with song. Wildflowers bloomed beside winding paths. The valley looked vibrant and alive. For Thomas and the villagers, the busy farming season had begun again. Yet every so often, something unusual would interrupt the familiar rhythm of village life. Something that reminded them the world extended far beyond their quiet valley. One such interruption arrived on a bright spring afternoon. A merchant caravan appeared on the distant road. At first, villagers noticed only a small cloud of dust. Then came the sound of wagon wheels, the jingling of harnesses, the voices of travelers. Children were the first to run toward the edge of the village. Soon, adults followed. Caravans were not common visitors. Whenever one arrived, curiosity spread quickly. As the travelers approached, the villagers could see several wagons pulled by sturdy horses. The wagons were covered with canvas. Bundles of goods were tied securely along the sides. The travelers themselves wore clothing unlike anything commonly seen in the village. Their cloaks were decorated with colorful embroidery. Their boots showed signs of long journeys. Their faces carried the weathered look of people who spent much of their lives on the road. At the head of the caravan rode a merchant named Geoffrey. He was an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes. His smile seemed permanent. He greeted the villagers warmly. The caravan would remain for several days before continuing its journey. The news spread quickly. Everyone wanted to see what goods the travelers carried. That evening, several wagons were arranged near the village square. The merchants opened wooden crates and carefully displayed their merchandise. To the villagers, it felt like a small market had suddenly appeared. There were bolts of colorful cloth, leather goods, fine knives, candles, jewelry, exotic spices, small wooden toys, and many other items rarely seen in such a remote place. Children stared in amazement. Adults examined the goods carefully. Some items came from nearby towns. Others had traveled hundreds of miles. A few had crossed entire kingdoms before reaching the village. For people who rarely traveled far from home, these objects felt almost magical. Each carried a story, a connection to distant places. Thomas wandered among the displays. One particular item caught his attention, a small brass compass. He had never seen one before. The merchant explained how travelers used it to find direction. Thomas listened with fascination. The idea seemed remarkable, a tool that could guide people through unfamiliar lands. The wider world suddenly felt a little less mysterious. That night, after trading concluded, many villagers gathered around a campfire with the merchants. The fire crackled softly beneath the stars. The travelers shared stories from their journeys, stories far more exotic than anything found in local legends. Jeffrey described a city several weeks away. Its streets were crowded with thousands of people. Its market stretched farther than the entire village. Stone buildings rose several stories high. Merchants from distant countries filled the squares. To the villagers, it sounded almost impossible. Their own village contained only a few dozen cottages. The thought of thousands of people living together seemed unimaginable. The merchant continued. He spoke of great rivers crossed by enormous bridges, of ships carrying cargo across vast seas, of mountain passes where snow remained throughout the year, of forests so large that travelers could spend days beneath their trees without seeing a single village. The listeners sat quietly. The firelight danced across their faces. Each person imagined those distant landscapes in their own way. Some felt wonder, some felt curiosity, some felt grateful for the simplicity of home. As Jeffrey spoke, Thomas realized something important. Although the merchant traveled widely, he often spoke fondly of small villages. He admired their sense of community, their peace, their familiarity. The merchant had seen castles and cities, yet he still appreciated simple places. This surprised Thomas. He had always assumed that larger places must be better. Perhaps that wasn't entirely true. Perhaps every place possessed its own value. The following morning, the merchants prepared for departure. Their wagons were packed once more. The horses were harnessed. Goods were secured. The road awaited. Before leaving, Jeffrey thanked the villagers for their hospitality. The villagers thanked him in return. The visit had brought more than merchandise. It had brought stories, new ideas, a glimpse of the wider world. As the caravan rolled away, children waved enthusiastically. Adults stood watching until the wagons disappeared beyond the hills. Soon the road became quiet again. The dust settled. The village returned to normal. Yet something lingered. The stories remained. That evening, Thomas sat beside the old oak tree. The sun was setting beyond the western hills. Golden light illuminated the valley. Birds settled into their nests. The air smelled of fresh grass and spring flowers. His thoughts returned to the merchants' tales, the great cities, the forests, the mountains, the distant roads. For a moment, he imagined following one of those roads himself, traveling beyond the horizon, seeing the wonders Geoffrey had described, but only for a moment. Then he smiled. Tomorrow, the fields would need attention, seeds would need planting. Life would continue here just as it always had. And that was enough. The world beyond the village might be vast and fascinating, but this valley was his home. The fields, the river, the church bells, the old oak tree. These were the things he knew, the things he loved. Above him, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone above distant cities and distant travelers, the same stars that guided merchants across unknown roads. And beneath those stars, the medieval village settled peacefully into another spring evening. The caravan was gone, but its stories would be remembered for many years to come. The spring rains had arrived. Gentle showers drifted across the valley, nourishing the newly planted fields. The earth smelled rich and fresh. Streams flowed a little faster. The countryside glowed with shades of green. For Thomas, much of life revolved around the land. The fields demanded constant attention. The seasons determined nearly every task. Yet beyond the fields existed another important part of medieval life, the manor. At the northern edge of the valley, overlooking the surrounding countryside, stood the Lord's Manor. It was not a great castle with towering walls and armies of knights. Instead, it was a large stone house surrounded by barns, workshops, gardens, and smaller buildings. Still, compared to the humble cottages of the villagers, it appeared impressive. Many villagers could see its roof from their fields. Its presence was a constant reminder of the social order that shaped medieval life. One morning, Thomas found himself walking toward the manor. Several villagers had been asked to assist with repairs to one of the estate's storage barns. Such arrangements were common. The relationship between villagers and the manor formed part of everyday life. As he approached, Thomas noticed details he rarely saw from afar. The stone walls were carefully maintained. Fruit trees lined the pathways. Flower gardens surrounded parts of the main house. Workers moved about the grounds performing various tasks. The manor functioned almost like a small village of its own. Inside the estate boundaries lived craftsmen, servants, laborers, and administrators. Each played a role in keeping the property running smoothly. Thomas joined several neighbors already working near the barn. Together, they repaired sections of the wooden roof damaged during winter storms. The work was familiar. Wood needed replacing. Beams required reinforcement. Nothing particularly unusual, yet from his position atop the roof, Thomas enjoyed a unique view of the valley. The fields stretched toward the horizon. The village rested beside the river. The church tower rose above the cottages. Everything looked peaceful from this height. As the morning progressed, Thomas occasionally observed life around the manor. Servants carried supplies between buildings. Gardeners tended flower beds. Messengers arrived on horseback. Visitors entered and departed. The manor connected the village to the wider world in ways many people rarely considered. News often arrived there first. Travelers frequently stopped there. Business and administration flowed through its halls. To many villagers, the manor represented authority, but it also represented stability. The estate maintained roads, organized local matters, and provided a framework around which village life operated. At midday, the workers paused for a meal. Thomas sat beneath a large oak tree near the manor grounds. The shade felt pleasant beneath the warming spring sun. Nearby, birds sang among the branches. The atmosphere was surprisingly calm. One of the older workers began sharing stories about previous generations. He spoke of former lords who had managed the estate long before Thomas was born. Some had been remembered fondly, others less so. The stories reminded everyone how much time had passed. People came and went. Generations changed. Yet the manor remained. The village remained. The fields remained. The rhythm of life continued. After lunch, Thomas resumed his work. The repairs progressed steadily. By afternoon, much of the roof had been restored. The barn looked stronger, safer, ready for another season. As he worked, he noticed the Lord himself walking across the grounds. Accompanied by a steward, the man moved slowly through the estate. He stopped occasionally to speak with workers or inspect projects. From a distance, the interaction seemed ordinary, less grand than many stories about nobles suggested. Life at the manor contained responsibilities just as life in the village did. Different responsibilities, certainly, but responsibilities nonetheless. The estate required management. Decisions needed making. Problems demanded solutions. As the day drew toward evening, the repairs were completed. The workers gathered their tools. The task had been successful. Thomas prepared to return home. Before leaving, he paused near the edge of the manor grounds and looked once more across the valley. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light. The river shimmered softly. Smoke rose from village chimneys. The old church stood quietly among the cottages. Everything appeared connected. The manor, the village, the fields, the forest, each formed part of a larger whole. Each depended upon the others. The realization felt comforting. The medieval world often seemed divided into different ranks and roles. Yet everyone contributed something. Farmers grew food. Blacksmiths repaired tools. Merchants transported goods. And the manor provided structure. Together, they created the community that allowed life to continue. As Thomas walked home along the familiar path, the evening breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Birds called softly from nearby hedges. The valley looked beautiful beneath the fading sunlight. By the time he reached the village, lanterns were beginning to appear in cottage windows. Families gathered around evening meals. Children played near doorways. Dogs wandered along the paths. Life continued exactly as it had the day before, and exactly as it likely would tomorrow. Yet after spending the day at the manor, Thomas felt a slightly deeper appreciation for the world around him. The village was more than a collection of cottages. The valley was more than a collection of fields. Everything was connected by countless unseen threads. Threads woven together through work, tradition, community, and time. The stars began appearing overhead as darkness settled across the countryside. The manor lights glowed faintly in the distance. The village grew quieter. And another peaceful day in the medieval valley came to an end. Spring had settled comfortably over the valley. The fields were green and growing. Wildflowers dotted the meadows. Birds filled the mornings with cheerful songs. The river flowed gently beneath clear blue skies. Life felt full of promise, and throughout the village there was an unusual sense of excitement. A wedding was approaching. News of the celebration had spread quickly. In a village where everyone knew one another, a wedding belonged to the entire community. It was more than the union of two people. It was a gathering, a feast, a celebration of family, friendship, and hope for the future. The couple was William, a young farmer, and Eleanor, the daughter of a local shepherd. Most villagers had known them since childhood. They had grown up together in the valley, played beneath the old oak tree, attended church together, worked alongside their families in the fields. Now they were preparing to begin a new chapter of life. Several days before the wedding, preparations filled the village. Women baked bread and cakes. Families contributed food for the feast. The blacksmith repaired benches and tables. Children gathered flowers from nearby meadows. Everyone wanted the celebration to be special. The old oak tree once again became the center of activity. Colorful ribbons were tied among its branches. Fresh flowers decorated the village square. Long wooden tables were arranged beneath the shade. The entire village seemed transformed. On the morning of the wedding, the weather could not have been more beautiful. The sun rose into a cloudless sky. A gentle breeze moved through the valley. The scent of flowers drifted through the air. Thomas awoke early and stepped outside. Already villagers were preparing for the day ahead. Children ran excitedly through the lanes. Neighbors greeted one another warmly. Laughter could be heard from every direction. Even the animals seemed unusually calm. It was the kind of day people would remember for years. As the morning progressed, families gathered near the church. The small stone building looked especially beautiful. Wildflowers decorated the entrance. The church bell rang softly across the valley. Its familiar sound seemed somehow brighter than usual. Inside, candles flickered gently. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Colorful patterns danced across the stone floor. Villagers filled the benches. The atmosphere felt peaceful and joyful. Soon, William arrived. He wore his finest tunic. Though simple by modern standards, it had been carefully prepared for the occasion. His nervous smile made several friends laugh quietly. Then Eleanor entered. The room grew silent. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the nearby meadows. Her dress was modest, yet beautiful. Sunlight illuminated her face as she walked down the aisle. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The ceremony itself was simple. The priest spoke of commitment, family, faith, and partnership. The words echoed softly through the church. The couple exchanged vows. The congregation smiled warmly. When the ceremony ended, the church bells rang once more. Their joyful sound carried across the countryside. Outside, villagers gathered to congratulate the newly married couple. Children tossed flower petals. Friends offered blessings. Laughter filled the air. The celebration had only just begun. Soon everyone made their way toward the village square. The feast awaited. The tables beneath the old oak tree overflowed with food. Fresh bread, cheese, roasted vegetables, honey cakes, apple pies, and many other dishes prepared by the villagers. For many families, this would be one of the most memorable meals of the year. Thomas sat beside Margaret and their children. Around them, conversations flowed easily. Stories were shared. Old memories resurfaced. Everyone seemed determined to enjoy the occasion. As afternoon turned toward evening, musicians arrived. A fiddler tuned his instrument. A flutist prepared a cheerful melody. Soon music filled the square. The first dancers stepped forward. Children eagerly joined them. Before long, nearly everyone was dancing. The village square became alive with movement. The music echoed between cottages. The sound carried across the fields. Even those who preferred sitting quietly could not help smiling. The happiness felt contagious. As the sun began its slow descent, the celebration reached its most beautiful moment. Golden light bathed the valley. The fields shimmered beneath the warm glow. The river reflected the colors of the sky. The old oak tree cast long shadows across the square. William and Eleanor sat together beneath its branches, surrounded by friends and family, surrounded by the community that had watched them grow. For Thomas, the scene felt deeply comforting. Life could be difficult. The seasons brought challenges. Storms arrived unexpectedly. Harvests sometimes failed. Winter could be harsh. Yet moments like this reminded everyone why community mattered. No family faced life alone. No person stood entirely by themselves. The village shared both hardships and celebrations. As darkness gradually settled over the countryside, lanterns were lit around the square. Their warm glow illuminated smiling faces. The musicians continued playing softer tunes. The conversations became quieter, more reflective. One by one, children fell asleep in their parents' arms. The excitement of the day had finally caught up with them. Eventually, families began returning home. The feast came to an end. The music faded. The lanterns flickered gently in the evening breeze. The village grew peaceful once more. Thomas lingered for a moment beneath the old oak tree. Above him, countless stars filled the sky. The same stars that had watched over countless weddings before this one, and countless celebrations yet to come. As he walked home through the quiet village, he reflected on the day. The wedding had been simple, yet beautiful. There had been no grand castles, no extravagant wealth, only family, friends, music, food, and genuine happiness. Sometimes he thought those things were more than enough. Inside his cottage, the fire burned softly. The children were already asleep. The village rested beneath the stars. And somewhere nearby, William and Eleanor began the first night of their new life together. A new chapter had begun, not only for them, but for the story of the village itself. For every wedding added another thread to the tapestry of generations that called the valley home. And under the peaceful spring sky, that story continued. The days grew longer as spring slowly faded into summer. Warm sunlight bathed the valley from morning until evening. The fields stretched across the countryside like endless carpets of green and gold. Wildflowers bloomed beside narrow paths. Bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom. The river sparkled beneath clear blue skies. Summer had arrived. For the villagers, this season brought both hard work and moments of joy. The crops were growing well. The wheat swayed gently in the breeze. The barley stood tall. The vegetable gardens flourished. If favorable weather continued, the harvest promised to be abundant. Yet amid the busy weeks of summer, there was one event everyone anticipated: the summer fair. Unlike the harvest festival, which celebrated the completion of the year's work, the summer fair offered a brief pause in the middle of the growing season. It was a chance to relax, to enjoy music, to meet visitors, and to forget daily responsibilities for a little while. The fair was held in a large meadow near the river. Several days before the event, villagers began preparing. Wooden stalls were constructed. Colorful banners were hung. Tables were arranged beneath temporary awnings. The entire meadow gradually transformed into a place of celebration. Children eagerly counted the days. Adults looked forward to the festivities just as much. When the morning of the fair finally arrived, the weather seemed perfect. The sky was cloudless. A gentle breeze drifted across the fields. The warmth of the sun felt pleasant rather than overwhelming. Thomas awoke early and walked toward the meadow. Already people were gathering. Families arrived carrying baskets of food. Merchants unloaded goods from wagons. Musicians tuned their instruments. The atmosphere felt cheerful and full of energy. Throughout the morning, the fair grew busier. Visitors arrived from neighboring villages. The meadow filled with voices. Laughter echoed across the grass. Children ran between stalls. Friends greeted one another warmly. The fair offered something for everyone. Some visitors examined handmade tools. Others admired colorful fabrics. There were games for children, food stalls for hungry travelers, and entertainers performing throughout the day. One merchant sold carved wooden animals. Another displayed beautiful pottery. A baker offered fresh honey cakes. The smell of baked bread mixed with the scent of summer flowers. Everywhere people seemed happy. For a few hours, ordinary concerns faded into the background. As midday approached, a rumor spread through the fair. A minstrel had arrived. The news traveled quickly. Traveling musicians were always welcome visitors. They brought songs from distant places, stories from faraway towns, and a sense of wonder that few villagers experienced in daily life. Soon a crowd gathered beneath a large willow tree near the riverbank. There stood the minstrel. He carried a lute polished by years of use. His cloak showed signs of long travel. A feather decorated his cap. His smile suggested someone who genuinely enjoyed entertaining others. The villagers settled onto the grass. Children sat near the front. Adults formed circles behind them. Even merchants paused their work to listen. The minstrel strummed the strings of his lute. A gentle melody drifted across the meadow. The crowd immediately fell silent. The music seemed perfectly suited to the summer afternoon, calm, peaceful, relaxing. Then the minstrel began to sing. His songs told stories of brave travelers crossing distant mountains, stories of sailors navigating stormy seas, stories of kings, queens, and forgotten heroes. Yet the songs were not loud or dramatic. Instead, they flowed gently like the nearby river. Each verse painted vivid pictures in the minds of listeners. Thomas found himself imagining every scene, the mountains, the castles, the forests, the roads stretching beyond the horizon. The music seemed to transport everyone far beyond the village. Yet somehow, it also made them appreciate their home more deeply. One particular song captured the attention of the crowd. It told the story of a farmer who spent years traveling the world. He visited magnificent cities, crossed vast deserts, sailed across distant seas. Yet after all his adventures, he returned to his village and discovered that the greatest treasure had always been home itself. The message felt familiar, comforting. Many listeners nodded quietly. Perhaps they understood exactly what the song meant. As the afternoon continued, the minstrel performed more melodies. Some were cheerful, some were thoughtful. Others carried a gentle sadness. Each one seemed perfectly suited to the peaceful rhythm of the fair. Meanwhile, life around the meadow continued. Children played games, Families shared meals. Friends exchanged stories. The river flowed quietly nearby. The fair felt timeless, like a moment suspended between seasons. As evening approached, the sunlight softened. Golden rays illuminated the meadow. The fields beyond glowed beneath the warm light. The entire valley seemed wrapped in beauty. The minstrel performed one final song. It was slower than the others, gentler, a melody about passing seasons and the passage of time. The song spoke of spring flowers, summer fields, autumn harvests, winter fires, and the generations who lived their lives within those familiar cycles. The crowd listened quietly. The music blended with the sounds of the evening breeze. For a few moments, everything felt perfectly peaceful. When the song ended, applause spread through the meadow. The villagers thanked the minstrel warmly. His visit had transformed an ordinary summer day into something memorable, something magical. As darkness gradually settled across the valley, lanterns were lit. Families began making their way home. The fair slowly came to an end. The stalls were dismantled. The merchants packed their goods. The meadow grew quiet once more. Thomas walked home beneath a sky filled with stars. The sounds of the fair lingered in its memory, especially the songs. Their melodies seemed to echo softly through the night air. When he reached the village, the cottages glowed warmly. The old oak trees stood silently beneath the moonlight. Everything felt calm, familiar, comforting. And as he prepared for sleep, Thomas reflected on the day. The summer fair would soon become another memory, another story shared beside future winter fires. Yet the music would remain. The songs would be remembered. And somewhere, far beyond the valley, the traveling minstrel would continue his journey, carrying melodies from one village to the next, adding new chapters to the endless story of the medieval world. Summer had reached its height. The fields surrounding the village stretched across the valley like waves of gold and green. The wheat was growing tall. The barley swayed gently in the warm breeze. Wild flowers lined the paths between farms. For weeks, the weather had been nearly perfect. The sun rose each morning into clear blue skies. The days were warm. The nights were pleasant. The villagers could hardly have asked for better conditions. Yet nature had a way of reminding everyone that it could never be fully controlled. One afternoon, Thomas noticed something unusual while working in his field. The air felt different, heavier somehow. The breeze that normally drifted through the valley had disappeared. Even the birds seemed quieter. He paused and looked toward the western horizon. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance. At first, they appeared harmless, small shapes against the sky. But as the hours passed, they grew larger, darker, more threatening. Across the valley, other farmers noticed them as well. People exchanged concerned glances. Summer storms were not uncommon. Most passed quickly, yet every farmer understood the danger they could bring. Strong winds could flatten crops. Heavy rain could flood fields. Lightning could start fires. The weather remained one of the few forces that no amount of preparation could completely overcome. By late afternoon, the sky had changed dramatically. The bright blue of morning had vanished. Dark gray clouds now covered much of the horizon. Shadows stretched across the fields. The sunlight grew weak. The valley seemed strangely quiet. The usual sounds of summer faded away. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Nature itself appeared to be waiting. Thomas gathered his tools and began walking toward the village. Other farmers were doing the same. There was little point remaining in the fields. The storm was clearly approaching. As he reached the village, the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. The sound was low and deep. Children stopped playing and looked toward the sky. Several villagers stepped outside their cottages. Everyone could sense what was coming. The wind returned suddenly. A strong gust swept through the village square. Leaves swirled around the old oak tree. Loose straw danced across the ground. Doors creaked. Shutters rattled. The atmosphere felt tense. Yet there was also something beautiful about it. The sky looked dramatic. The clouds moved like dark rivers across the heavens. The air carried the scent of rain, a scent that many farmers welcomed despite the danger. Rain, after all, was essential for healthy crops. The challenge was receiving the right amount. Not too little, not too much. As evening approached, the storm finally arrived. The first raindrops fell slowly, large drops that struck the dusty ground with soft splashes. For a few minutes, the rainfall remained gentle, almost peaceful. Then everything changed. The rain intensified. Within moments, water poured from the sky. The rooftops echoed with its sound. The village roads became muddy streams. The fields disappeared behind curtains of rain. Thunder rolled across the valley. Lightning illuminated the dark clouds. The storm had reached its full strength. Inside his cottage, Thomas sat near the hearth with his family. The fire burned steadily. The room felt warm and safe. Outside, however, nature displayed its power. Rain hammered against the roof. Wind rattled the walls. Thunder shook the windows. The children watched with wide eyes. Though they had experienced storms before, each one felt extraordinary. Margaret reassured them calmly. Storms were part of life. The village had survived countless storms in the past. It would survive this one, too. Hours passed. The rain continued. The wind howled through the valley. Yet gradually, something began to change. The thunder became less frequent. The lightning moved farther away. The rain softened. As summer continued, the villagers often sought help from the village healer, a wise woman whose knowledge of herbs and plants had been passed down through generations. Using remedies gathered from forests, fields, and gardens, she cared for the sick and reminded the villagers of their deep connection to nature. Life beyond the village was equally important. Thomas spent time in the nearby forest, gathering firewood and observing the wildlife that shared the land. The forest provided timber, food, medicine, and shelter, making it an essential part of village survival. Along the river stood the village mill, where grain harvested from the fields was transformed into flour. The turning water wheel never seemed to rest, serving as one of the most important pieces of technology in the medieval world. Without it, producing bread for the community would have been far more difficult. High in the hills, shepherds watched over their flocks. Their quiet lives were spent beneath open skies, following ancient routes and protecting sheep from storms and predators. Though often alone, they remained a vital part of the village economy. As autumn returned, the great market brought merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and entertainers from distant places. Villagers traded goods, shared stories, and caught rare glimpses of the wider world beyond their valley. Then came one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. Snow covered the roads for weeks. Rivers froze. Travel became nearly impossible, yet during the harsh season, the villagers demonstrated remarkable kindness. Families shared food, firewood, and shelter, proving that community was often the strongest protection against hardship. Years passed, children grew up, new families formed, old villagers passed away. Time continued its steady march forward. One day, a powerful storm swept across the valley and finally brought down the ancient oak tree that had stood at the center of village life for generations. The villagers mourned its loss. Beneath its branches, they had celebrated weddings, festivals, markets, and countless ordinary days. Though the tree was gone, its memory lived on in stories passed from one generation to the next. And then, a century later, the village still stood. Thomas was gone. His children were gone. Even their grandchildren had become part of history. But the village endured. New farmers worked the same fields. New children played beside the river. The church bells continued to ring. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Spring followed winter. Summer followed spring. Autumn followed summer. And winter always returned once more. The names of individual villagers slowly faded from memory, but the life they built remained. The roads they walked were still used. The fields they cultivated still produced crops. The traditions they cherished still brought people together. And so the story of the medieval farmer comes to a gentle close. Not with a great battle, not with the rise of a king, but with something far quieter, the continuation of everyday life. Because history is not only made by famous rulers and mighty armies, it is also made by ordinary people, farmers who planted seeds, blacksmiths who repaired tools, millers who ground grain, shepherds who watched over their flocks, parents who raised children, neighbors who helped one another. These ordinary lives formed the foundation of the medieval world. And though centuries have passed, their story still echoes through the fields, rivers, forests, and villages they once called home. As night settles over the valley one final time, the fields rest beneath the moonlight. The river flows softly through the darkness. The stars shine overhead, just as they did 100 years ago. The village sleeps peacefully, and somewhere in the gentle whisper of the wind, the story of the medieval farmer lives on. The end